Now, Clarence Carlson is a historian, and he wrote in this book called, there was a series of books on American history, and he wrote this book called, there was a section in this book called The Voluntary Way, and he talks about this whole way of human interaction coming about through voluntary association. So this was a whole section that he wrote in his book. Part of this voluntary association was our economic relations. The economic relations were, again, we talked about the spontaneous order and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Originally, for reasons I might go into in a later date, the American early pilgrims who first came on this shore, they experimented with common ownership of property in what we would refer to now as a form of socialism. And the experiment was a dismal failure. It did not work at all. And Governor Bradford, who was governor of the Plymouth colony, noted that such an approach was more in line with utopian schemes of Plato than the principles of the Bible. And this is what Governor Bradford had to say about this experiment. The experience that has had in this common course and condition tried sundry years, that amongst godly and sober men may well invite the vanities and conceit of Plato's and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that by taking away a property and bringing it into a commonwealth, it would somehow make them happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God. Okay. So this is what he's saying, is this understanding that you can take property away from people and hold it into a common and then distribute it, and everybody's going to be happy and you're going to have prosperity, is more of a utopian scheme reminiscent of Plato's Republic. It doesn't say Republic, but that's where it comes from, Plato's Republic. And Plato's Republic is the prototype of almost all of utopian schemes that have come forward since, including a lot of our modern ones today. And we seem to be repeating the same mistakes over and over again because we're not learning from history. But they learned this, and they recognized that this was contrary to God's understanding, because then they go back and read the Bible. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's good, indicates that thy neighbor has a right to his goods, so that there is a divine sanction for private property rights. And you can't just take something from someone for some utopian good that you have. And because this violates human nature, doing something this way, regardless of what you think is going to create the public good, and they thought so. And they tried this under the most advantageous conditions possible. And it did not work. It was a miserable failure. We're still trying it today, and it still does not work. And the reason why it doesn't work is it violates basic conditions of human nature. And again, we're in the future, in future approach, we'll go into that, and we'll go into why. But I want to quickly compare and contrast the socialist approach to the free market approach and the basic differences. In the socialist approach, the assumption is that the basic foundation of the economics, the material for which, capital upon which the economic engine runs, is physical raw material. And physical raw material is limited. So there's only so much to go around. So if one person gains, another person is going to lose. So justice necessarily has to take the form of someone compensating this material and distributing it all equally so that everybody can have an equal share. Now, this sounds pretty attractive until you consider the alternative. The capitalist view, which came from the Judeo-Christian understanding of human beings being created in God's image, physical raw material is not the engine of capital. The word capital comes from the Latin word caput, which means head or mind. So the engine of capital, of wealth creation, of economic opportunity, is human ingenuity and creativity. Which again is not surprising, because if we are created in the image of a creator, then essentially we are creative beings. And so therefore an activity that maximizes human creativity is more natural to human nature. It's more in line with human nature, and therefore is more likely to allow for the flourishing of human civilization. And this is not theoretical. This approach was tried in its extreme by the Quakers, the early Quakers in Pennsylvania. the Quakers at that time were a lot different than they are today. But the Quakers were not economic theorists. Their experiment had nothing to do with economics. They believed that all human relationships were to be based upon the idea of brotherly love. There should be no force in human relationships, and that human nature was based upon the inner light of the indwelling presence of Christ within. And so everything could be done through the indwelling presence of Christ within the individual and the brotherly relationships without. There is no need, and not only is there no need, but it is absolutely illegitimate to have any relationship based upon force. So therefore government, not even limited government, is out of the question. There is a article on the internet. It's called A Holy Experiment in Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is French for leave us alone, and is usually associated with the extreme libertarian view of no government. But this experiment was actually created by religious people for religious purposes that had nothing to do with economics. And they, for a period of time, that they a certain number of years, they had almost no government at all. And then at one point, okay, we're supposed to levy some taxes. So there was a few basic sales taxes they levied, but they didn't collect them. So for practical purposes, they had no government and no taxes. Complete laissez-faire society, and where the government was completely non-existent. And the Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, gave his name from this experiment. And in a short period of time, they overtook economically a lot of their neighbors, except for Boston. Now, all these other neighbors around them were well established, much longer than they were. But they, in a short period of time, they overtook, and they became second to Boston in many measures of economic prosperity. So this experiment, long time before Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations and this, came out, because Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. The time of the American Revolution, and a lot of our founders were reading it. But the Quaker experience went way back before that, and so we had an experiment in complete laissez-faire that almost worked. Now we're going to go into some parts of it that didn't quite work, and I'm going to talk about that later. But a lot of it worked, and so some of the writings of Locke and Jefferson and many others were based upon an understanding of that experiment. They influenced, because they practically experimented with this, the thinking of these theorists later. Without their practical experience, a lot of these writings wouldn't be possible, because it would have been just conjecture. And so these people were not just dreaming up theories. They were looking back upon practical experiences of people who had tried this and saw that for a large part it worked. Now, defending themselves against wild Indians might have been something they might want to consider. I'm going to talk about that now. We'll talk about that later. But there are some aspects where they took this a little too far, and so where they succeeded well, and we can learn from them. And where their drawbacks were, we can learn from that too. But that's something we're going to go into in the future.